A very good morning, my dear students and friends. I'm Dr. Urus Ilyas. I'm professor in Department of Wildlife Sciences, Aligarh Muslim University, and teaching the different subjects of wildlife. My specialization is the mammal ecology, population ecology, and um, techniques. Apart from that, I'm very much interested in the research. And recently, I have got a major research project on ANRF, funded by ANRF SERP. So, welcome back. And today we will be discussing about the conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use. We have already done a lot with the CBD conservation, biodiversity conservation. So, now we will be discussing about the conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use. So, biodiversity refer to the number, variety and variability of the living organism. We all know about it. It measures the total number of different type of living organism and to which extent they are different from each other. Biodiversity is a concept of a higher logical plane than biological resources. Hence, biodiversity is the source of biological resources and that is the critical point of its value for human being. Biodiversity means biological resources. It is also important for forestry, fisheries and agriculture which depend on rich water variety of various biological resources available in nature, and loss of biodiversity exert heavy economic and social costs for any country. Biological diversity encompasses diversity at three levels. We already know genetic diversity, species diversity and ecological diversity. And there are types of biodiversity. Among the types of biodiversity, genetic diversity is the genetic diversity that refer to the diversity of genes within a species. A gene is the basic unit of heredity and its combination generate the characteristic unique to a living organism. Within individual species, there are a number of varieties which are slightly different from one another. These differences are due to differences in combination of the genes. So, genetic factor including gene, chromosomes and DNA are not only responsible for similarities of the organism, but also determine the uniqueness of each individual within each species. For example, the rice variety belong to the species of Rhiza sativa, but there are thousands of wild and cultivated varieties of rice which shows variation at the genetic level and are different in their color, size, shape, nutrient content of the plant. We have basmati rice, we have zira rice. So, there are thousands of hundreds, thousands of variety of rice, and that is these differences because of the genes. Species diversity that refer to the variety of different species like plant, animal and microorganism, that is diversity between different species. Being the basic unit of biological diversity, species can be defined as a group of similar organisms that inbreed or share a common lineage of descent. A species made up of population of which member can inbreed under natural circumstances within any intervention. There are more than 20 million organisms on the earth which have been identified and given name. Apple, mango, grapes, wheat, rice, guava, etc. are examples of plant species. Ecosystem diversity, the diversity in the ecosystem, the kind of ecosystem we have. The diversity at the ecological or habitat level is known as the ecosystem diversity. A large region with different ecosystem can be considered an ecosystem diversity. CBD defines ecosystem as a functional unit where communities of living organisms and their non-living environment interacting with each other. An ecosystem contains all living and non-living or living constituent required for its organisms functioning and their long-term survival. The ecosystem also shows variation with respect to physical parameters like moisture, temperature, altitude, precipitation. So, these are the physical parameters. Along with these there are many more, and because of that they show, the ecosystem shows the variation. We have different ecosystem in Himalayas, and that is different from the ecosystem of the Gangetic plain. So these are the characteristic, and those characteristic, those physical parameters are the moisture, temperature, altitude, precipitation. So for example, forest ecosystem is supposed to have many dominance of trees, but while considering a tropical rainforest, a tropical deciduous forest and a temperate forest, variation observed are numerous due to variation in physical factor. Significance of biodiversity, that is the basic life, basis of the life. Biodiversity is the basis of the life. The survival and future of humankind entirely depend on biodiversity. If there are no food, we cannot survive. If there's no plants, we cannot write because we can't have papers. If there's no plants, we cannot wear because we can't make plants and animal. They produce the silk and the cotton. Whatever we are wearing are from the nature. So biodiversity, that is the basis of the life. It constitutes the web of life in which all life forms are interacting with each other and their surrounding environment, since it provides good and services for the maintenance of human life. Loss of biological diversity results in destructive consequences for humankind. It means food and clean water shortage that would result in malnutrition and epidemic diseases and absence of livelihood possibilities. Biodiversity plays an important role in the spiritual and cultural life of societies, and human beings of the society are shaped on their biological environment, impressed by its excellence and power, and reflect their connection with the nature in arts, lifestyle, and value. For instance, they use plants and animals as symbol of their identity, such as by using them in flags, figures, and other visual arts. So we are using lots of pictures of the animals and the plants in our to depict different things. Now this is the significance of the biodiversity. Now come to the conservation of biodiversity. Conservation is the protection, preservation, management or restoration of wildlife and natural resources such as forests, water bodies, etc. Survival of many species and habitat which are threatened due to human activities can be ensured through the conservation of biodiversity. There is an urgent need not only to manage and conserve the biotic wealth, but also to restore the degraded ecosystem. Humans have been directly or indirectly dependent on biodiversity for their sustenance to a considerable extent. Increasing population pressure and development activities have led to large-scale depletion of the natural resources. Biodiversity conservation is meant for management of human activities in the environment so that it does not lead to habitat destruction and loss of biodiversity. The conservation of biodiversity is carried out to preserve and protect the species in their habitat, to maintain essential ecological process so that there is no ecological imbalance created, to use the species and ecosystem sustainable without exploiting them, to preserve flora and fauna, natural parks, sanctuary, biosphere reserves, etc. are created. To conserve the genetic biodiversity by establishing the zoological garden, botanical garden, nurseries, to ensure proper planning of land use and other natural resources so as to conserve the biodiversity. To prohibit the hunting, of course, the poaching should be prohibited. Hunting is not allowed in India, but some part of the world hunting is legal. To prohibit the hunting, poaching of animal, fishing, etc. beyond the productive capacity of the ecosystem, to ensure biodiversity maintenance by enforcing the acts, law of the legislative control such as Indian Forest Act, Endangered Species Act, Wildlife Protection Act. So these are the some acts, there are many acts. By enforcing those acts, we can still control the loss of biodiversity. And apart from that, the public awareness about sustainable use of the species without affecting the biodiversity is must. To delineate the particular areas as reserve so that no activity is permitted in the zone, for example, reserve forest. To conserve the biodiversity with regard to plants and animals, a number of measures are now being taken the world over. Types of conservation, there are two kinds of conservation. One is the in situ conservation, another is the ex situ conservation. In situ conservation means declaring the areas as the protected areas like sanctuaries, national park, wildlife reserve. Ex situ conservation means protecting the species outside its habitat, creating the natural habitat. Artificial natural habitat like zoos. So, protected area network, sacred lakes, groves, biosphere reserve, national parks, sanctuaries, national park and wildlife sanctuaries. And biosphere reserve could be terrestrial biosphere reserve, could be marine uh, biosphere reserve. Ex situ conservation are sacred plants, home gardens are the ex situ conservation. Seed banks, field gene banks, cryopreservation. Botanical garden, arboreta, zoological garden, aquaria, these all are the way to conserve the biodiversity. So, there are major two types of biodiversity conservation. One is the in situ conservation and there is the ex situ conservation. In situ conservation means protecting the species in its natural habitat. And when we are not able to protect the species in its natural habitat, what we do? We create the more or less similar and safe habitat and bring the species there, a plant there and protect them. That is called ex situ, outside the natural habitat, outside its home, preservation. So, in situ conservation and the ex situ conservation. So, we will be taking one by one. First is the in situ conservation. So, in situ conservation is on-site conservation or the conservation of genetic resources in natural population of plants or animal species such as forest, genetic resources and natural population of tree species. It is the process of protecting an endangered plant or animal species in its natural habitat either by protecting or cleaning up the habitat itself or by defending the species from predator. The role of protected area in maintaining biodiversity is in situ conservation is done by declaring the particular area as the protected areas. We all we know that there are four different categories of the protected area in India: the wildlife sanctuary, the national park, community reserve and the conservation reserve. It may be set aside for protection of biodiversity and of natural and associated cultural resources and is managed through legal or effective means. This include national park and nature reserve, sustainable use reserves, wilderness areas and heritage sites. Protected area have been widely used as a conservation tool in order to maintaining a representative sample of unaltered species, an ecosystem for the future and no limit and to limit the potential for environmental degradation through human mismanagement of the resources. At present, approximately 8,500 protected areas exist throughout the world in 169 countries. In the past, it was assumed that the best way of preserve biodiversity was to conserve it through protected area by reducing human activities or completely excluding human. Population growth and poverty were seen as main cause of environmental degradation. People were regarded as a problem from which the environment needed protection. According to protected area and park were fenced off from local people, traditional practices were prohibited and people were held under penalties of fines or imprisonment for utilization park resources. India has a number of protected areas which includes 106 national park, 573 wildlife sanctuary, 115 community reserve and 115 conservation reserve and 220 community reserve, 18 biosphere reserve. So what are the national park? National park is an area which is strictly reserved for the betterment of the wildlife and where activities like forest and grazing of cultivated area are not permitted. In these parks, even private ownership rights are not allowed. Their boundaries are well marked and circumscribed. They are usually small reserves spreading in an area of 100 to 500 square kilometer. In national parks, the emphasis is given on the preservation of a single plant or animal species. List of some major national parks of India, like the first national park of India was the Haley National Park, which was later on named as a Corbett National Park after the name of the Jim Corbett. Jim Corbett, he was the naturalist, hunter conservationist. So Corbett National Park is the first national park declared in India. Then we have Dudhia National Park, Gir National Park, Kanha National Park, Kaziranga, Nandadevi National Park. So these are the national parks, and like this we have 106 national parks. Wildlife sanctuaries. A sanctuary is a protected area which is reserved for the conservation of only animal in which the human activities like harvesting of timber, collection, minor forest produce and private ownership rights are allowed as long as they do not interfere with the well-being of the animal. Boundaries of sanctuaries are not well defined and controlled biotic interference is permitted. For example, tourism activities. So, there are some important wildlife sanctuaries like Ghana Bird Sanctuary, that is in the Rajasthan, Hazaribagh Wildlife Sanctuary, that is in the Jharkhand, Madumalai Wildlife Sanctuary, Tamil Nadu, Jaldapada Wildlife Sanctuary, Mount Abu Wildlife Sanctuary, Binsar Wildlife Sanctuary, Ascot Musk Deer Sanctuary. So these are the some important sanctuaries, and like this we have more than we have around 573 wildlife sanctuaries. Then we have the community reserve. The community reserve, the government of India later on realized it's very difficult to declare this area as a national park and the sanctuary. So they added two more categories of the protected area. One is the community reserve and another is the conservation reserve. So the community reserve, any private or community land not comprised with a national park, sanctuary or conservation reserve where the community or an individual has volunteered to conserve wildlife and its habitat can be notified by the state government under section 36C of Wildlife Protection Act 1972. So at present there are 220 existing community reserve, and some of the community reserves are the Arunachal Pradesh, there are in Bihar, some are in the Haryana. So these are the community reserve means the major input is from the locals, and the land for the community reserve belong to the local community. While in the conservation reserve, the land belongs to the government. It is adjacent next to the national park or the sanctuary. So a conservation reserve is a protected area that's established to conserve wildlife and habitat while also allowing for sustainable human activities. Conservation reserves are often created on government-owned land that connect or act as a buffer zone between other protected areas such as national park and wildlife sanctuary. So at present there are 115 existing conservation reserves. Jhilmil Jheel is one of the conservation reserve, and Jhilmil Jheel is the area where the population of the swamp deer were discovered. So Gujarat have one conservation reserve, Haryana has two, Himachal Pradesh has three. So there are 115 existing conservation reserves. The only difference between the community reserves and the conservation reserve is that the community reserves are declared, the land belongs to the local community and the people actually protect the wildlife and biodiversity. While the conservation reserve, the land belongs to the government. It is the government land and very close to the protected area. Sometimes it acts as a buffer to the protected area. The next is the biosphere reserve. Biosphere reserve is international category. It is a special category of the protected area where human population also form is form a part of the system. Biospherism means holistic approach where the human as well as biodiversity both are protected. They are large protected areas, usually more than 5,000 square kilometer. A biosphere reserve has three parts: core zone, buffer zone and transitional zone. Core zone is the inner zone. This is undisturbed and legally protected area. Buffer zone lies between the core and transitional zone. Some research and educational activities are permitted here. And the transitional zone is the outermost part of the biosphere reserve. Here cropping, forestry, recreation, fisheries and other activities are allowed. The main function of biodiversity reserves are conservation, to ensure the conservation of ecosystem, species and genetic resources; development, to promote economic development while maintaining cultural, social and ecological identity; and the scientific research, to provide support for research related to monitoring and educational, local, national and global issues. So, the biosphere reserves are in some way as living laboratories for testing out and demonstrating integrated management of land, water and biodiversity. The some important biosphere reserves are the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve, Manas Biosphere, Gulf of Mannar, Great Nicobar, Panchmadi Biosphere Reserve. So, these are the some important biosphere reserve. And so, what are the uses of the in situ conservation? The main uses of the in situ conservation is the flora and fauna live in natural habitat without human interference. The life cycle of the organism and their evaluation progress in a natural way. In situ conservation provide the required green cover and its associated benefit to our environment. It is less expensive or easy to manage. The interests of the indigenous people are also protected. So, this was about the in situ conservation. Come to the ex situ conservation. In situ is on-site conservation, while ex situ is outside. Ex situ conservation is the preservation of component of biological diversity outside their natural habitat. This involves conservation of genetic resources as well as wild and cultivated species and draw on a diverse body of technical and techniques and the facilities. Such strategies include establishment of biological garden, zoos, construction, conservation strands and gene, pollen seeds, seedlings, tissue culture and DNA banks. So, these are the some example of the ex situ conservation. There are different methods of ex situ conservation. Seed gene bank, we know that genes, since ages we are protecting the genes so that we can have the better crop. We are changing the genes so that we can improve the quality of the crop. So, seed gene bank, these are cold storage where seeds are kept under controlled temperature and humidity for storage, and this is easier way to store the germplasm of plant at low temperature. Seed preserved under controlled condition remain viable for long duration of time. Gene banks, genetic variability also is preserved by gene bank under normal growing condition. These are cold storage where germplasm is kept under controlled temperature and humidity for storage. Cryopreservation, this is the newest application of technology for preservation of biotic part. This type of conservation is done in liquid nitrogen at very low temperature, that is minus 196 degrees centigrade. Tissue culture banks, cryopreservation of disease-free meristem in very helpful long-term culture of excited roots and shoots are maintained. Meristem culture is very popular in plant propagation as its virus and disease-free method of multiplication. Long-term captive breeding, the method involves capture, maintenance and captive breeding on long-term basis of individual of the endangered species which have lost their habitat permanently or certain highly unfavorable conditions are present in their habitat. Botanical gardens. A botanical garden is a place where flowers, fruits and vegetables are grown. The botanical garden provides beauty and calm environment. Most of them have started keeping exotic plant of education and research purposes. Animal translocation, release of animal in a new locality which come from anywhere else. Zoological garden or zoos. So the zoological garden and zoos, in zoos wild animals are maintained in captivity, and conservation of wild animals, rare endangered species. Basically zoos were started as a private zoos, private places to keep the animals, and later on zoos, the government recognized and given the recognition to these zoos, some of these zoos, and they usually serve as the rescue, the shelter for the rescued animal. So basically, rescued animal and those animal who have less population, so they are being brought in zoos for the breeding, and the population increases, the individuals are released in the forest. So zoological garden and zoos, in world there are about 800 zoos. Some zoos have undertaken captive breeding program also. The use of ex situ preservation, it is useful for declining population of species. Endangered animal on the verge of extinction are successfully bred. Threatened species are bred in captivity and then released in the natural habitat. Ex situ centers offer the possibilities of observing wild animals, which is otherwise not possible. It is extremely useful for conducting research and scientific work on different species. The threat to biodiversity extinction or elimination. A species in a natural habitat may face extinction or elimination as per natural process of evolution. During evolution, different species have died out or lost of species in the past. Following a slow process, the process of extinction has been particularly fast in the recent year of human civilization due to anthropogenic activities. If the present trend continue, we would lose 1/3 to 2/3 of the current biodiversity by the middle of 21st century. Sustainable use of biodiversity. To use biodiversity in a sustainable manner means to use natural resources at a rate that the earth can renew them. It is a way to ensure that we meet the need of both present and future generation. As the human population increases, so does the pressure on ecosystem. Since we draw over ever more resource from them, our ecological footprints on the planet is sustainable and will become unbeatable unless we change our consumption pattern and our behavior in general. In the past, humans have adapted to changing condition by increasing productivity, but now we have reached the limit of Earth's capacity. Today, our opinion is to manage by productivity and resources in a sustainable manner, reducing waste wherever possible, using the principle of adaptive management and taking into account traditional knowledge which contribute to maintenance of the resources. Within the conservation of biodiversity and within the CBD, Convention of the Biodiversity, sustainable use principles are applied to sectors that most affect biodiversity such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism and water management. In 2004, CBD parties adopted the Addis Ababa Principle of Guideline for the Sustainable Use of Biodiversity, a set of 14 principles that apply to all activities and areas. In 2010, these principles were reaffirmed and their implementation across through an in-depth review. By adopting the CBD 1992, government commit themselves to integrate conservation and sustainable use into their policies at the national level. By minimizing biodiversity loss and helping local population restore degraded area, together we can make this a new era of environmentally sound, economically dependent. So thank you very much, my dear students and friends. We'll be meeting in our next class. Till then, enjoy this lecture. Thank you.